In the dark days of early 1943, deep in the South Pacific, a former Navy mechanic was about to change the course of the war with what military brass would later call an illegal modification. His name was Paul Irvin Gunn, but everyone called him Pappy, and what he did to a standard B-25 Mitchell bomber would turn it into the most feared weapon the Japanese forces had ever faced in the Pacific theater. This is the story of how one man's ingenuity, born from desperation and driven by personal tragedy, created a flying gunship so devastating that it would help eliminate over 3,000 enemy combatants in a single day, during what General Douglas MacArthur would call the decisive aerial engagement of the war in the Southwest Pacific. Before we dive into this incredible story, if you're enjoying this content, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring you more incredible true stories from World War II, and leave a comment below. We love hearing your thoughts and answering your questions about these historical events. October 18th, 1899. Quitman, Arkansas. A boy is born who will one day revolutionize aerial warfare. But Paul Irvin Gunn's path to becoming a war hero was anything but conventional. Growing up in rural Arkansas, young Paul was captivated by the miracle of flight after reading stories about fighter pilots serving in Europe during the First World War. At age 10, he saw his first airplane, and from that moment, his fate was sealed. When America entered World War I in 1917, 18-year-old Paul Gunn registered for the draft on September 12, 1918. He enlisted in the U.S. Navy in the waning days of the war, but not as a pilot. His poor education, having left school after 6th grade, prevented him from becoming an officer. Instead, he became an aviation mechanist's mate, learning the intricate technical skills that would later define his legacy. But Paul Gunn had dreams that wouldn't be grounded by paperwork. While serving at Pensacola, he spent every spare moment around aircraft, learning how they worked, understanding their strengths and weaknesses. He saved every cent of his military pay and did the unthinkable. He bought himself a surplus seaplane and taught himself to fly. This wasn't just passion, this was obsession. This was a man who refused to let his circumstances define his destiny. In 1921, Gunn married Clara Louise Crosby, known as Polly. They would have 4 children together, 2 sons and 2 daughters. But Gunn's story was far from a simple family tale. After leaving the Navy initially, he discovered that the service had begun allowing enlisted men to train as pilots. He re-enlisted immediately. By the spring of 1925, Paul Gunn had achieved what many thought impossible. He graduated as a Navy pilot, not as an officer, but as an enlisted naval aviator. For the next 12 years, he served with distinction flying fighters and seaplanes, instructing new pilots at Pensacola, and even serving as a VIP pilot at Anacostia Naval Air Station in Washington. After 20 years of service in December 1939, Chief Petty Officer Paul Gunn retired from the Navy. At 40 years old, he moved his family to Hawaii to start a charter flying service. Within months, he was hired to establish an airline in the Philippines, flying Twin Beach passenger planes. Life was good. His family was together. The future looked bright. Then came December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor shattered not just the American Pacific Fleet, but the lives of millions. For Paul Gunn, now living in the Philippines with his wife and 4 children, the nightmare was just beginning. As Japanese forces swept through the Pacific with terrifying speed, the situation in the Philippines became increasingly desperate. Captain Paul Gunn, now commissioned into the Army Air Corps, flew reconnaissance and transport missions as the Japanese advanced. He survived being shot down by Japanese fighters, crashing in the jungle, and making his way back to friendly lines. But as the situation deteriorated, Gunn faced an impossible choice. In late December 1941, he was ordered to evacuate key U.S. personnel to Australia. He had to leave his wife and 4 children behind. On January 20th, 1942, Polly Gunn and their 4 children were interned by the Japanese at the University of Santo Tomas in Manila. They would remain prisoners for 3 long years. Imagine that moment. Imagine being forced to leave your family in enemy hands, not knowing if you would ever see them again. That pain, that rage, that desperate need to fight back would fuel everything Paul Gunn did for the rest of the war. Australia, early 1942. The situation was desperate. The Japanese seemed unstoppable. They had conquered much of Southeast Asia, were threatening Australia itself, and Allied forces were being pushed back on every front. The air war was going particularly badly. American bombers designed for high-altitude strategic bombing were proving ineffective against the fast-moving Japanese ships and ground targets. Traditional bombing tactics weren't working. B-17 flying fortresses would fly at high altitude, drop their bombs, and watch as Japanese ships simply maneuvered out of the way. The bombs that did hit often failed to penetrate enough to sink their targets. Something had to change. Enter Paul Gunn. In January 1942, 20 crated P-40 Kitty Hawks arrived in Brisbane. Gunn rounded up a crew of American and Australian personnel and began assembling them at a furious pace. The young airman, working with the 42-year-old Gunn, started calling him Pappy, a nickname that would stick for the rest of his life. But assembling fighters was just the beginning. Pappy Gunn looked at the Douglas A-20 Havoc light bombers arriving in Australia and saw wasted potential. These aircraft had a bomb bay, yes, but their forward armament was pitiful. 4 .30 caliber machine guns in the nose. Against Japanese ships and installations, this was like throwing pebbles at a tank. Gunn had an idea, a crazy, brilliant, technically challenging idea. What if he could mount 50 caliber machine guns in the nose of these aircraft, the kind of devastating firepower that could shred enemy targets at low level? The official channels would have laughed at him. The manufacturers had designed the aircraft a certain way for a reason. Modifications would void warranties, create balance issues, potentially make the aircraft dangerous to fly. The answer would have been no. Pappy Gunn didn't ask for permission. In August 1942 at Charters Towers Airfield south of Townsville, Gunn began his modifications. He removed the Bombardier station from an A-20 Havoc and installed 4 50 caliber machine guns, with 2 more mounted on the sides of the fuselage. 6 50 caliber machine guns pointing forward. The firepower was staggering, but here's where the story gets even more remarkable. Where did Gunn get these machine guns? From wrecked fighters, from P-39 Airacobras and P-40 Warhawks that had crashed during training, aircraft that would never fly again, but whose weapons could be given new life. This was field innovation at its finest. This was a mechanic who understood that, in war, you use everything you have, waste nothing, and sometimes the best solutions come from necessity rather than official doctrine. Enter Major General George Kenney. In summer 1942, Kenney arrived in Australia to take command of the Allied Air Forces in the Southwest Pacific. Shortly after his arrival, he visited the 3rd Attack Group at Charters Towers. There, in a shelter, he found Pappy Gunn working on an A-20, covered in grease, surrounded by tools and machine gun parts. When Kenney learned what Gunn was doing, that he was salvaging weapons from wrecked fighters and installing them in bombers, he didn't shut the operation down. He recognized genius when he saw it. Kenney immediately made Gunn a member of his personal staff as Special Projects Officer. The message was clear. Whatever crazy ideas Pappy Gunn had, he now had the full backing of the theater commander to make them happen. The modified A-20s proved devastatingly effective. On September 12, 1942, they were used in a successful raid against a Japanese airfield at Buna. Flying at low level, the concentrated firepower from 650 caliber machine guns per aircraft shredded Japanese planes on the ground, destroyed fuel dumps, and sent the enemy scrambling. But Gunn wasn't satisfied. The A-20 was good, but there was a bigger aircraft that could carry even more weapons, the B-25 Mitchell medium bomber. The B-25 was already a proven aircraft. It had been used in the famous Doolittle raid on Tokyo in April 1942. But those aircraft had been used for their intended purpose as medium bombers. Pappy Gunn saw something different when he looked at a B-25. He saw a gun platform. Working with Jack Fox, the senior technical representative of North American Aviation, Gunn began modifying B-25 Mitchells. First came 4 forward-firing .50 caliber machine guns in the solid nose, replacing the Bombardier's station. Then 6, then 8. The modifications didn't stop there. Gunn added additional fuel tanks to extend range, modified bomb racks to carry smaller fragmentation bombs, and developed entirely new tactics for low-level attack. This wasn't just about bolting guns onto an aircraft. This was about completely reimagining what that aircraft could do. By early 1943, Gunn's modified B-25s were operational. These aircraft carried 8 .50 caliber machine guns in the nose, plus additional guns in side blisters and turrets. When all guns fired at once, the aircraft would physically slow down from the recoil. The sound was described as similar to ripping canvas, but amplified 1,000 times. The effect on targets was apocalyptic. Some of the later factory-built versions, incorporating Gunn's innovations, would carry 18 .50 caliber machine guns. 18. That's the forward-firing armament of 3 P-51 Mustangs, all concentrated in a single medium bomber. It was the most heavily armed aircraft in the Pacific Theater. Now, you might be wondering about that word in our title, illegal. Why would these modifications be considered illegal? The answer lies in military bureaucracy and aircraft certification. Every modification to a military aircraft was supposed to go through official channels, be tested, be approved, be documented. Gunn's field modifications bypassed all of that. He was changing aircraft weight distribution, altering their flight characteristics, adding systems that hadn't been engineered by the manufacturer. From a paperwork perspective, these aircraft were no longer airworthy according to their type certificates. If one of these modified aircraft had crashed due to the modifications, and if the crew had survived to file a report, Gunn could have faced court-martial. He was technically violating regulations with every aircraft he modified. But in war, results matter more than regulations, and the results were about to speak for themselves in the most dramatic way possible. Late February 1943, Allied intelligence, having broken Japanese codes, learned of a major Japanese operation. A convoy was being assembled at Rabaul to reinforce Japanese positions at Lae in New Guinea. This wasn't just any convoy. This was critical to Japanese plans in the region. 8 transport ships would carry approximately 6,900 troops of the 51st Division, along with supplies and equipment. 8 destroyers would provide escort. Additionally, approximately 100 Japanese fighter aircraft would provide air cover. The Japanese High Command knew this operation was risky. Allied air power in the region had grown significantly. But they calculated that the troops were desperately needed at Lae, and the alternative of landing them elsewhere and having them march through hostile terrain was even more dangerous. On the night of February 28, 1943, the convoy departed Rabaul. Intelligence reached Allied command almost immediately. General Kenney ordered his forces to prepare for the largest coordinated air attack yet attempted in the Pacific Theater. The plan was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its execution. Multiple squadrons would attack from different directions simultaneously. Heavy bombers would strike from medium altitude to break up the convoy's formation. Then Pappy Gunn's modified B-25s and A-20s would come in at masthead height, their concentrated firepower turning the ocean into a killing field. The weather initially worked in the Japanese favor. Heavy cloud cover on March 1st and early March 2nd prevented effective attacks. The Japanese convoy commander probably felt a surge of hope. Perhaps they would make it through after all. March 3, 1943, dawned with clearing skies. The Japanese convoy was now in the Bismarck Sea, heading toward Leh. They had no idea what was coming. At the Cape Ward Hunt rendezvous point on the north coast of New Guinea, Allied aircraft assembled. B-17 Flying Fortresses, B-24 Liberators, A-20 Bostons, and Pappy Guns modified B-25 Mitchells. Escorting them were P-38 Lightning fighters. In total, over 100 Allied aircraft prepared to attack. Around noon, the Japanese convoy spotted the approaching aircraft. Alarms sounded. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire. Japanese fighter escorts dove to attack. The ships began evasive maneuvers. The battle that followed would change Pacific warfare forever. The B-17s came in first, flying at 7,000 feet. Their bombs fell toward the convoy, forcing the ships to scatter, breaking up their tight defensive formation. This was exactly as planned. A scattered convoy was a vulnerable convoy. Then came the medium bombers, and this is where Pappy Guns modifications proved their worth. The B-25 strafers came in low, some at masthead height, meaning they were flying so close to the water that the Japanese ships' upper-mounted anti-aircraft guns couldn't depress low enough to target them effectively. What the Japanese crew saw was terrifying. These weren't aircraft dropping bombs from high altitude that could be evaded. These were aircraft flying directly at them with their noses ablaze with machine gun fire. 8 50-caliber machine guns per aircraft, at close range, all firing simultaneously. The effect was catastrophic. 50-caliber rounds at that rate of fire could penetrate steel hulls, could explode fuel stores, could shred anything in their path. Japanese sailors and soldiers on deck had nowhere to hide. The concentrated fire swept across the ships like a steel storm, but Guns pilots didn't just strafe. They had practiced a technique called skip bombing. Flying at low altitude, they would release bombs that would literally skip across the water like stones, slamming into the sides of ships below the waterline. Combined with the strafing, this dual attack was overwhelming. One pilot described it. You could see our tracers walking right up the side of the ship, then the bombs hitting and exploding, and then we'd pull up, and the next guy was right behind us doing the same thing. It was like nothing I'd ever seen. The Japanese ships tried to fight back. Their anti-aircraft fire filled the sky. Japanese Zero fighters dove on the Allied aircraft. Some of the B-25s took hits. But the attack was coordinated, coming from multiple directions, and the Japanese defenses were simply overwhelmed. Ship after ship was hit. The transport ships, packed with troops, were especially vulnerable. When the strafing fire and skip bombs hit them, the results were catastrophic. Some ships exploded, others caught fire, some capsized. Within a span of minutes, not hours, the carefully assembled Japanese convoy was being torn apart. One Japanese officer aboard one of the destroyers later wrote, "The enemy attack was unbelievable in its ferocity. I had seen air attacks before, but nothing like this. It was as if the aircraft themselves were weapons, not just delivery systems for bombs. The sound of their guns was continuous, like thunder that never stopped." The attacking continued through the afternoon of March 3rd and into March 4th. Allied aircraft returned again and again to strike at the surviving ships and rescue craft. This phase of the battle was controversial, but from a military perspective, the objective was clear: prevent the Japanese reinforcements from reaching Leh. When the battle finally ended, the results were staggering. All 8 Japanese transport ships had been sunk. 4 of the 8 destroyers had been sent to the bottom. Of the approximately 6,900 troops that had departed Rabaul, only about 800 to 1,200 actually reached Leh. Another 2,700 were rescued by submarines and destroyers and returned to Rabaul. And the rest, approximately 2,890 Japanese soldiers and sailors, perished in the battle. Some went down with their ships, others perished in the water afterward. The exact numbers vary depending on the source, but what's undeniable is that this was one of the most decisive defeats the Japanese had suffered in the Pacific War to that point. Allied losses, by comparison, were minimal. 13 aircrew were lost, 10 in combat, and 3 in an accident. 4 aircraft were lost in combat, and 2 more in accidents. The kill ratio was almost unbelievable. For every Allied airman lost, over 200 Japanese combatants had perished. General Douglas MacArthur called the Battle of the Bismarck Sea the decisive aerial engagement of the war in the Southwest Pacific. General Kenney was more poetic, saying it was the most complete and annihilating combat of all time. But perhaps the most telling response came from the Japanese themselves. After the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters made a decision. Never again would they attempt to send a large convoy through waters controlled by Allied aircraft. The entire Japanese strategy for reinforcing and supplying their troops in New Guinea had to be completely rethought. They were forced to use smaller vessels, traveling at night, taking longer routes along the coast. The logistical difficulties this created were immense and contributed significantly to the eventual Japanese defeat in the New Guinea campaign. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, the effectiveness of Pappy Gunn's modifications was undeniable. Reports flooded back to the United States. North American Aviation, the manufacturer of the B-25, began incorporating variations of Gunn's innovations into their production aircraft. The B-25G model came with a 75mm cannon in the nose, though this proved less effective than Gunn's machine gun configurations. The B-25H followed with 1450 caliber machine guns. The B-25J gunship version carried 18. These factory-built strafers, inspired by Pappy Gunn's field modifications, went on to wreak havoc on Japanese targets throughout the Pacific. They struck shipping in the Philippines, bombed installations on Okinawa, attacked targets throughout the island chains. The concept that Gunn had pioneered, the heavily armed strafer flying at low level with devastating firepower, became a standard tactic. But for Pappy Gunn, the war was personal in ways that few others experienced. Remember, his wife and 4 children were still interned in Manila. Every mission he flew, every modification he made, every Japanese target destroyed was done with the knowledge that his family was suffering in enemy hands. In 1943, Gunn was promoted to major and sent back to the United States to oversee factory production of the modified B-25s at North American Aviation. He worked with engineers to refine his field modifications for mass production, but being away from the front, away from the fight, must have been torture for a man whose family was still imprisoned. By 1944, Gunn was back in the Pacific flying combat missions. In late 1944, during a Japanese bombing attack on Leyte in the Philippines, Gunn was wounded. The injuries were serious enough to remove him from combat operations, but for Gunn, this timing might have been a blessing in disguise. February 1945, American forces liberated Manila. Among those freed from the University of Santo Tomas internment camp were Polly Gunn and the couple's 4 children. After 3 years of separation, of not knowing if they would ever see each other again, the Gunn family was finally reunited. One can only imagine that reunion, the tears, the embraces, the realization that despite everything, they had all survived. For Pappy Gunn, the war had taken on a different meaning at that moment. He had fought to save his family, and against all odds, he had succeeded. Pappy Gunn retired from the Army on June 30, 1948, as a full colonel. His decorations included 2 Distinguished Flying Crosses, the Silver Star, Legion of Merit, Air Medal, and 9 Purple Hearts. 9 times he had been wounded. 9 times he had returned to duty. But for Gunn, the war was never fully about the medals. In later years, when asked about his contributions, he reportedly said, I just did what needed to be done. We had aircraft that weren't working the way they needed to. I fixed them. That's what a mechanic does. This humility, this matter-of-fact attitude about accomplishments that changed the course of the Pacific War, was typical of Pappy Gunn. To him, it wasn't about glory. It was about doing the job, protecting the people who mattered, and using every skill he had to make a difference. After the war, Gunn returned to the Philippines and rebuilt Philippine Airlines, the company he had started before the war. The airline expanded to provide flights across the South Pacific and still operates today, a living legacy of Gunn's entrepreneurial spirit. October 11, 1957. Paul Irvin Pappy Gunn was flying a chartered Beechcraft 18 over the Philippines when he encountered a severe storm. The aircraft crashed and Gunn perished. He was 2 weeks shy of his 58th birthday. He was laid to rest at Barrancas National Cemetery at Naval Air Station Pensacola, the same base where he had learned to fly decades earlier, where he had met his wife, where his dreams of aviation had first taken flight. The legacy of Pappy Gunn extends far beyond his own life. The tactics he pioneered, the modifications he developed, influenced aircraft design and combat doctrine for decades. The concept of the gunship, an aircraft designed not primarily to drop bombs, but to provide concentrated firepower through mounted guns, can be traced directly back to Gunn's work in 1942 and 1943. The AC-47 Spooky, the AC-130 Spectre gunships used in Vietnam and subsequent conflicts, the A-10 Thunderbolt with its massive GAU-8 Avenger cannon, all of these owe a debt to the ideas Pappy Gunn proved in the skies over the Pacific. But perhaps the greatest lesson from Pappy Gunn's story isn't about aircraft or tactics. It's about the power of innovation in the face of adversity. It's about refusing to accept that something can't be done just because it hasn't been done before. It's about using every skill, every resource, every bit of ingenuity to overcome seemingly impossible odds. When official channels move too slowly, when traditional methods aren't working, sometimes what's needed is someone willing to think differently, to try the untested, to risk failure for the chance of success. Pappy Gunn was that person, a mechanic who became a pilot who became an engineer who became a tactician who changed the course of a war. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea, where Gunn's modifications proved their ultimate worth, remains one of the most lopsided victories in military aviation history. The claim that 3,000 Japanese combatants were eliminated in 15 minutes isn't precisely accurate. The battle lasted 3 days. But the devastating attacks on March 3, 1943, the day when Gunn's strafers tore through the Japanese convoy with unprecedented fury, those attacks were measured in minutes, not hours, and the effectiveness was beyond anything the Japanese had prepared for. A Japanese destroyer captain, Tamei Chihara, who survived the battle, later wrote, "Japan's defeat there was unbelievable. We had been told that American bombers could not effectively attack ships at sea." The Battle of the Bismarck Sea proved that assumption devastatingly wrong. The low-level attacks by those gun-equipped bombers were something we had no defense against. When I saw them coming, all I could think was that we were facing flying fortresses that could shoot back. In the broader context of World War II, the Pacific theater often gets less attention than the European theater. The island-hopping campaigns, the naval battles, the desperate struggles in the jungles of New Guinea and the Philippines sometimes fade in comparison to the massive tank battles of the Eastern Front or the D-Day landings. But make no mistake, what happened in the Pacific was every bit as crucial to the Allied victory. And men like Pappy Gunn, working in the shadows, innovating in workshops far from the spotlight, were as vital to that victory as any frontline soldier. The story of Pappy Gunn reminds us that war is not just won by grand strategies and massive armies. It's also won by individuals who refuse to accept defeat, who see possibilities where others see obstacles, who turn limitations into opportunities. When historians examine why the Allies won World War II, they point to industrial capacity, to code breaking, to strategic decisions made by commanders. But they should also point to men like Paul Irvin, Pappy Gunn, a mechanic who looked at a bomber and saw a gunship, a father fighting to save his family, an innovator who changed the rules of engagement. The B-25 Mitchell bomber in its original form was a fine aircraft, but it took a man with grease under his fingernails and fire in his heart to unlock its true potential. That potential was measured in Japanese ships sent to the bottom of the Bismarck Sea, in troops who never reached their destination, in the eventual liberation of a family from internment, in a war that was won a little bit sooner because someone refused to accept that things had to be done the way they had always been done. If you found this story fascinating, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We're committed to bringing you more incredible true stories from World War II, stories of courage, innovation, and determination that shaped the world we live in today. And we'd love to hear from you in the comments. Do you have family members who served in the Pacific Theater? Have you heard stories about Pappy Gunn or the Battle of the Bismarck Sea? Share your thoughts below. In closing, let's remember that the greatest weapons in war aren't always the ones that appear in specifications or training manuals. Sometimes the greatest weapon is the human mind, the refusal to quit, and the determination to do whatever it takes to protect the people and causes you believe in. Paul Irvin Pappy Gunn embodied that spirit. From a boy in Arkansas who dreamed of flying, to a mechanic who taught himself to pilot, to an engineer who revolutionized aerial warfare, to a father who never gave up hope of seeing his family again, his story is one of the great American tales of World War II. The next time you see a restored B-25 Mitchell at an air show, perhaps painted in the colors of the Pacific Theater with nose art and mission markings, take a moment to remember that what you're seeing isn't just a historical artifact. You're looking at the canvas on which Pappy Gunn painted his masterpiece. You're seeing the tool he used to change history. And remember this, somewhere in the cockpit of that beautiful aircraft, if you listen carefully enough, you can almost hear the echo of 1850 caliber machine guns firing in unison, the sound of innovation and determination rolled into one devastating war-winning package. That sound, that terrible and magnificent thunder, was the sound of one man refusing to accept defeat. That was the sound of Pappy Gunn's legacy, and it echoes still.